Tonight, we explore one of the darkest chapters in Los Angeles history, a case that haunted a community for more than 25 years. South Los Angeles, a place already burdened with crime and hardship, became the hunting ground for a man who would take lives without leaving a name. For decades, women disappeared. Their bodies were found in alleys, abandoned lots, or behind dilapidated buildings. Police had DNA evidence from several victims, but every lead ended in frustration, and every investigation seemed to vanish into the shadows. No one knew the face behind the murders. No one could connect the crimes. The killings began in 1985, yet they continued, stretching across decades with long gaps between them. The media would later call the perpetrator the Grim Sleeper, a name that captured the horror of the unknown, the relentless absence of justice, and the enduring fear within the community. Neighbors whispered about the disappearances. Families mourned silently, often ignored by the very system meant to protect them. The turning point came in 2008, and it came from the most unexpected source. Police had been struggling for years, collecting DNA from crime scenes and comparing it against national databases, but no match appeared. Then, a routine arrest of a young man for a weapons charge changed everything. That young man was the son of Lonnie Franklin Jr., a man living quietly in South Los Angeles, appearing as any other neighbor might. When investigators compared the son's DNA to the Grim Sleeper's evidence, they found a connection, an extremely rare familial link, one in millions. This connection gave police the first solid lead in decades. Franklin had managed to remain invisible, hiding in plain sight, while a trail of victims remained. The investigation required patience and precision. Officers followed Franklin, observing his habits, mapping his movements, and waiting for an opportunity to confirm their suspicions. That opportunity arrived in a seemingly ordinary moment, a discarded pizza crust. Undercover detectives collected the crust, sent it to the lab, and confirmed what they had suspected. The DNA matched exactly. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the man who had eluded justice for more than 25 years, was finally identified as the Grim Sleeper. The city reacted with shock. Families of victims, some who had given up hope, found a measure of closure. The investigation would lead to a trial, revelations about Franklin's life, and the final reckoning for a man who had hidden in plain sight. Tonight, we examine the details of his crimes, the painstaking work that brought him to justice, and the lives that were forever changed by his actions. In this episode, we will follow the story of Lonnie Franklin Jr., exploring the victims he left behind, the investigation that cracked the case, and the trial that revealed the full extent of his actions. If you want to understand how one of Los Angeles' most terrifying serial killers was finally unmasked, stay with us. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was born in 1952 in Los Angeles, California. On the surface, he appeared ordinary, a man who worked as a mechanic, served in the military, and lived quietly in South Los Angeles. But beneath that ordinary exterior, a darkness remained hidden, one that would take decades to reveal. Franklin grew up in a city that was itself undergoing transformation, a city marked by poverty, racial tension, and crime. In neighborhoods like South Los Angeles, opportunities were limited, and violence was a part of everyday life. These were the streets where Franklin would later select his victims, where he would move unnoticed among those he preyed upon. The women Franklin targeted were often vulnerable, many struggling with addiction or economic hardship. They were mothers, daughters, and friends whose lives mattered to someone, even if the world had largely ignored them. Among them were Teresa Ballard, Catherine Newsom, and Julia Sweeney, names that would later become central to a case that spanned decades. Their disappearances often went unnoticed for days, weeks, or longer, and the police initially struggled to identify patterns. In some cases, families reported missing loved ones only to have the reports minimized or delayed. Franklin exploited this invisibility, moving through the community without drawing suspicion, carefully selecting victims who were least likely to be protected or noticed. Neighbors often described Franklin as quiet, polite, and unremarkable. He worked in automotive repair shops, interacted with friends and acquaintances, and attended church services. He blended into the community, a man who gave no outward sign of the violence he was capable of. But in the shadows, his actions told a different story. Evidence would later show that Franklin's crimes were not random. He had a method, a pattern that spanned over 20 years. Bodies were left in locations accessible but concealed, often near alleys or trash-strewn lots. He struck repeatedly, then disappeared for periods lasting years. This pattern of activity and inactivity would earn him the name Grim Sleeper, a chilling reference to the gaps between his killings, periods when the community believed the threat had vanished. Franklin's personal life appeared stable to those around him. He had a family, maintained employment, and carried out the routines of daily life. Yet behind closed doors, the evidence of his crimes would eventually emerge. DNA left at multiple crime scenes, a trail that only modern forensic science could ultimately link. His victims were diverse in age, appearance, and circumstance, but they shared a common vulnerability, and Franklin took advantage of it with calculated precision. The environment of South Los Angeles during this period cannot be ignored. The late 1980s and 1990s were marked by high crime rates, gang activity, and systemic neglect of certain neighborhoods. Police departments were often underfunded and overstretched, and families of missing persons sometimes felt they were fighting alone. It was in this context that Franklin carried out his crimes, relying on the city's chaos and the inattention of authorities to remain hidden. Tonight we will continue to uncover the lives lost, the choices made by Lonnie Franklin Jr., and the forces at play in South Los Angeles that allowed one man to evade justice for more than 2 decades. The story of the Grim Sleeper is not only the story of a killer but also a reflection of the city, the community, and the victims who were waiting to be found. The first known murders attributed to Lonnie Franklin Jr. began in the mid-1980s, though some experts believe he may have begun earlier, testing boundaries and targeting women whose absence would not immediately raise alarm. Each victim's story was different, but each followed a chilling pattern. Franklin would identify women on the margins of society, some struggling with addiction, some living in impoverished neighborhoods, and he would follow them, learning their routines, their movements, and the moments when they were most vulnerable. Teresa Ballard was one of the earliest confirmed victims. She was a woman with a past that made her presence in the world precarious, yet she had family who cared for her, and a life that was abruptly ended by someone who had watched her from the shadows. Catherine Newsom, another victim, vanished under circumstances that at first appeared unrelated to the others. Only through the meticulous work of forensic investigators years later did the connections emerge. Franklin's crimes were methodical. He did not strike in haste, nor did he leave witnesses. He left bodies in areas where they might be discovered but not immediately linked, and he left DNA that at the time could not yet identify him. For more than 2 decades, Franklin moved undetected among the streets of South Los Angeles. He committed his murders with a chilling regularity and then would vanish sometimes for years at a time. This long gap between killings earned him the moniker Grim Sleeper. It was a period when investigators had little to connect the crimes, and the community grew increasingly fearful and frustrated. Each disappearance added to a growing sense of dread, yet the man responsible walked freely among the people he terrorized. Neighbors and acquaintances often described Franklin as quiet and unobtrusive, someone who could be trusted, someone who blended seamlessly into the environment. But his actions revealed a man capable of extreme violence. Julia Sweeney, found murdered in the late 1990s, was discovered in a trash-strewn alley. Her life ended in a manner consistent with previous victims. Each killing seemed calculated, deliberate, and conducted with a precision that frustrated police efforts. Witness statements were sparse, and the fear within the community often silenced potential informants. Franklin exploited this silence. The media coverage at the time reflected the growing anxiety, but law enforcement struggled to connect the cases. It was only through the accumulation of DNA evidence and the painstaking cataloging of missing women that patterns began to emerge. Franklin's choice of victims, the locations of the bodies, and the timing of the attacks created a sequence that, in retrospect, revealed a chilling intelligence and careful planning. These crimes were not random acts of violence. They were part of a decades-long series of calculated murders, They left families grieving, neighborhoods on edge, and law enforcement searching for a shadow that could not be caught. Franklin's ability to commit these acts without detection demonstrates a calculated patience, a willingness to wait and strike again when the opportunity arose. Tonight, we will examine how the grim sleeper operated, how he selected his victims, and how the combination of meticulous planning and community neglect allowed him to evade capture for more than 25 years. We will explore the chilling details of each crime, the fear instilled in those who lived in South Los Angeles, and the painstaking path that would eventually bring Lonnie Franklin Jr. to justice. The investigation into the grim sleeper killings began in earnest after the connection between multiple murders was established through DNA. For years, detectives struggled to find a pattern. The victims were largely women from South Los Angeles, often involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. Their lives, overlooked by many, became the common thread that linked the killings. Police worked tirelessly to piece together evidence, collecting DNA samples, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing crime scenes. But the perpetrator remained elusive. Each murder investigation presented obstacles. Crime scenes were often contaminated, witnesses were unreliable or too fearful to speak, and the city itself seemed indifferent to the disappearances of women who lived on the margins. Officers knew they were chasing a pattern, but for decades, the puzzle had too many missing pieces. Early DNA testing produced no matches, and the case files grew year by year with no resolution. Families grew frustrated, communities fearful, and detectives haunted by the inability to prevent the next death. In 2008, a breakthrough came in an unexpected way. Police had collected DNA from multiple victims over the years, but the national database had yielded no matches. Then, during a routine arrest, Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s son, Christopher Franklin, was taken into custody for a weapons charge. His DNA was entered into the database, and analysts noticed something extraordinary. There was a familial link between Christopher Franklin and the grim sleeper's DNA. Statistically, such a match was exceedingly rare, 1 in millions. For the first time, investigators had a lead that could point to a suspect who had walked freely among the community for decades. With this lead, detectives began a careful, methodical operation to confirm Franklin's identity as the grim sleeper. Officers conducted surveillance, observing his daily routines, noting the places he frequented, and waiting for the right opportunity to obtain his DNA without alerting him to the investigation. The breakthrough came in an ordinary moment, a discarded pizza crust. Undercover officers collected the crust and sent it for analysis. The results were conclusive. Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s DNA matched exactly to the grim sleeper samples collected over 25 years. The revelation stunned investigators. A man who had been living quietly, blending into the community, was the same person responsible for the murders that had terrorized South Los Angeles for decades. Detectives reviewed decades of case files, cross-referencing locations, times, and methods, confirming that Franklin had committed at least 10 murders and 1 attempted murder, though many suspect the true number could be higher. The investigation did not stop at identification. Detectives worked to build an airtight case, gathering evidence, interviewing survivors, and documenting Franklin's movements. Each piece of evidence was crucial to ensure that the trial would secure a conviction. The painstaking process took years, but every lead, every detail, and every DNA sample brought Franklin closer to the justice he had long evaded. Tonight, we follow the investigation that finally captured the grim sleeper. We will examine how forensic science, patience, and the careful work of detectives unraveled the mystery of a killer who had eluded justice for more than 25 years, and how a single extraordinary DNA match would change the course of the case forever. The arrest of Lonnie Franklin Jr. in July 2010 brought an abrupt halt to more than 2 decades of terror in South Los Angeles. For many in the community, the revelation that the grim sleeper had been living quietly among them was shocking. Franklin appeared unremarkable to neighbors, quiet, polite, almost ordinary, but investigators now knew the truth. He had committed a series of murders that spanned over 25 years. With his arrest, the focus shifted from uncertainty to the meticulous preparation for a trial that would reveal the full extent of his actions. The trial began amid intense media scrutiny and public interest. Prosecutors brought forward charges of 10 counts of murder and 1 attempted murder, focusing on the patterns and precision that defined Franklin's crimes. Witnesses, including survivors who had narrowly escaped his attacks, provided testimony that painted a vivid picture of the danger he posed. Forensic experts explained how DNA collected over decades linked Franklin to the crimes, presenting a level of scientific certainty that was undeniable. Every piece of evidence, from the discarded pizza crust that finally confirmed his identity to the minute traces found at multiple crime scenes, was presented in detail, leaving little room for doubt. Franklin's defense team attempted to challenge the evidence, questioning the reliability of the DNA and the testimonies of witnesses. They argued that the familial DNA match was circumstantial, and they scrutinized the procedures of investigators. But the prosecution had anticipated these arguments. The case was methodically constructed to show not only Franklin's culpability, but also the consistency of his methods and the long pattern of his crimes. Testimonies included chilling details of Franklin's interactions with victims, emphasizing the deliberate nature of his actions and the choices that separated him from the ordinary lives he led in the community. Courtroom observers noted the stark contrast between Franklin's calm demeanor and the emotional testimonies of families who had waited years for answers. Each account highlighted the personal cost of his crimes, the grief, the fear, and the frustration that had accumulated over decades. Families of victims spoke, some tearfully, recounting the moments they realized their loved ones were gone, the unanswered questions that had haunted them, and the relief, tempered by sorrow, that Franklin had finally been apprehended. After months of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict that reflected the weight of evidence and testimony. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was found guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase revealed the full gravity of the law's response. Franklin received the death penalty, a sentence that acknowledged the deliberate, repeated, and long-lasting nature of his crimes. The verdict was met with mixed reactions: relief among families and investigators, and reflection on how a man could evade justice for so long while living openly in the community. The trial of Lonnie Franklin Jr. revealed the depth of his actions, the resilience of investigators who refused to abandon the case, and the role of modern forensic science in achieving justice. It was a confrontation with decades of loss, fear, and unanswered questions. Through the trial, the grim sleeper's pattern was fully exposed, the victims' voices finally heard, and the system's ability to deliver justice tested and affirmed. Tonight, we continue to explore the aftermath of this case, the impact on the community, the families, and the ongoing questions that remain about one of Los Angeles's most infamous serial killers. The conviction of Lonnie Franklin Jr. brought a measure of closure to some, yet it did not erase the impact of his crimes on South Los Angeles. The neighborhoods where Franklin had operated for decades were left with the memory of lives cut short, families shattered, and a community forever marked by fear. For the loved ones of his victims, the trial answered some questions, but others remained. How had a man known to many as quiet and ordinary committed murders over 25 years without detection? How many women had been taken before Franklin's first confirmed victim, and how many might never be identified? The case also prompted reflection on the role of law enforcement and forensic science. The use of familial DNA, which linked Franklin's son to the grim sleeper's evidence, had been unprecedented in many ways. This rare breakthrough, a 1-in-million statistical chance, demonstrated the power of genetics in modern criminal investigation, while also highlighting the delays that allowed Franklin to continue his crimes. Police officers involved in the investigation later acknowledged the painstaking work required to confirm Franklin's identity and build a case strong enough to secure a conviction. Surveillance, evidence collection, and cross-referencing decades of unsolved murders were necessary to ensure the integrity of the prosecution. The aftermath of Franklin's conviction also raised difficult questions about systemic failures. Many of his victims were women whose lives were marginalized, whose disappearances did not initially receive the attention they deserved. Community members and activists emphasized that Franklin had exploited societal neglect, moving through South Los Angeles unnoticed for decades. In response, some law enforcement agencies reviewed policies related to missing persons and DNA evidence, seeking to prevent such prolonged gaps in justice. Even after his conviction, Franklin's actions sparked speculation. Some experts suggested he may have been responsible for more murders than those confirmed, possibly taking lives during periods when his activity went unrecorded. Others questioned the reasons behind the nearly 14-year gap between murders, from 1988 to 2002, wondering whether he had been temporarily incarcerated, relocated, or simply lying in wait. These unanswered questions contributed to a persistent unease, a recognition that the full extent of Franklin's crimes might never be known. Survivors and families of victims became central figures in the story of the Grim Sleeper's legacy. Their courage in testifying, sharing memories, and demanding justice highlighted the human cost of Franklin's actions. The community, once gripped by fear, began to reflect on resilience, accountability, and the importance of vigilance. Franklin's case became a reference point in discussions about the importance of forensic technology, the consequences of systemic neglect, and the ways communities can support vulnerable members to prevent future tragedies. Tonight, as we examine the aftermath of Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s crimes, we also consider the enduring questions. How does a man commit decades of murders without detection? How do communities recover from such prolonged trauma? And what lessons remain for law enforcement and society at large? The story of the Grim Sleeper is not only a story of one man's crimes, but a story of survival, loss, and the relentless pursuit of justice that ultimately brought a decades-long nightmare to an end.